You know, one of the dangers of reviewing a lot of products is that at some point, what you say in the past may eventually come back and haunt you in the future. And I'm having one of those moments right now. You see, a number of months ago, I published a video going on about how the Harbeth P3 ESR may be one of the last speakers I ever buy for myself. The reason being is I like the speaker so much in the desktop environment that I could easily live with it for the rest of my life. And yet, here I am about to review a similar product that's practically nipping at the heels of the P3 in terms of performance, only for a lot less money. So let's roll the intro and talk about it. Alright, so here it is, the focus of today's review, the SoundArtist LS35A. Yep, yet another LS35A inspired speaker from China from a company that few people have heard of because it's brand new and has no real history. Now I'll be honest with you guys, most of the time I would never consider a speaker like this for review. But I rolled the dice and I'm glad I did because the performance is actually quite incredible for the money. Speaking of which, they retail for $600 a pair, shipped directly from China. So now let's take a closer look at what you get, starting with the veneer. So this features an MDF box with a real wood, rosewood veneer. And I gotta say, I really like it. In certain lighting, it's really dark and rich. If you put it in more direct sunlight, it takes on more of this red color. And then in certain incandescent lighting situations, it has more of this dull brown aesthetic to it. Of course, this has your classic LS35A look with the classic dimensions. So let's take a closer look down here. We have this grill in a brown color. I do wish it was black, but I gotta say this grill is really nice. It uses this soft touch material. It actually feels quite a bit nicer than what's on my Harbeth, to be honest. Yeah, the name is cringy, but the good news is that it's just a sticker. You can peel it right off and away you go. So I do have to warn you guys, when you take the grill off at first, it's going to be very difficult. It's fastened on there quite tightly, but just give it a little bit of elbow grease and it'll come off. And once it does, it's actually very easy to take off afterwards. Also, I need to mention that these speakers, like all LS35As, were voiced with the grills in place, so this is where they're going to sound their best. But anyways, when you take off the grill, you have your classic look. We have this foam padding for diffraction. We're going to have our quarter inch soft dome tweeter. Look, I don't know if it's made of the Mylar material, but it's supposed to be a KEF T27 replica. Beneath that, we are going to have our 5-inch woofer. I'm guessing it's the KEF B110 replica. Can't be sure if it's the Bextrin or whatever material. I just genuinely don't know. But yeah, it's the classic aesthetic. In fact, some of you may be wondering, why is there Velcro and staples? Who would want that? Well, this is just an homage to how the original speakers were made. In fact, that's the whole point of this product. It's not going to be for everybody. So now let's quickly turn it around. This is going to be the back, very simple. We have our label, set a 5-way binding post. So overall, everything looks good. Look, it's not the same kind of build quality that you get from, like, say, a Graham, Sterling, Falcon, or Harbeth, but it seems to be pretty solid for the price. So now let's talk about how it sounds. Okay guys, so I have a lot of ground to cover, so this is the game plan. First, I'm going to dedicate this part of the review to those of you who have no experience with an LS35A. And let's face it, that's pretty much most of you. So if you're somebody who just wants to know how this compact speaker sounds and whether or not it'd be good for you, then this section is for you. Now, for people who do have experience with the LS35A, at the very end of this video, I have a comparison for you between the SoundArtist and the Harbeth P3 ESRs. That should give you just a little bit more valuable insight as to what they bring to the table. But first, for those of you who have no experience with LS35As, basically what you are getting is this compact sealed monitor that can sound really, really good, but only if you use it in the appropriate application. So where these speakers sound best is going to be number one, in the desktop environment where the speakers are only maybe a couple feet from your ears, or number two, in a smaller bedroom, especially for people who like to listen at low to medium volumes and you're somebody who values effortless resolution and natural tone over just having a sheer quantity of sound. Now, I need to make it clear though that these speakers can handle a wide variety of music very well, within their physical limitations, of course, because the one thing about a lot of small audiophile products is that, well, they only tend to sound best with audiophile, small scale music. But with these, I was kind of surprised. I mean, I threw metal their way, I threw electronic music their way, some hip hop to them, and they handled it very well. Even full scale classical actually sounded pretty good. Again, within the limitations of a small speaker, but the one thing that just kept reoccurring to me over and over again is, man, these have a very entertaining sound, and I really like the tone and just how they handle all this different music. It's a really cool little experience. Or a little speaker that delivers a cool experience is a better way to put it. So now let's talk about the actual sound and what you can expect if you were to bring them home. So first, they do have this slightly laid back and warm sounding presentation. But when you listen to them, it's clear that they don't have this kind of boring, super smooth sound. In fact, if anything, they actually have a mild V curve. The bass is boosted just a little bit. The treble actually has some liveliness and some energy there, which is a small departure from your typical LS35A sound. So, breaking things down into more detail, first let's start off with the treble. So, when it comes to the overall voicing of the product, I noticed that the upper mid-range features a little dip, and then the lower treble features a spike, and then it rolls off very sharply. And when you combine that voicing with a soft dome tweeter, what you get is a pretty interesting result. You get this liveliness and energy in the top end that's never really overbearing, it's never sibilant, it's never harsh. Even on less than perfect recordings, you just get this nice presence, this energy. And I noticed this first when I was listening to Jimi Hendrix, and just the way that the sound was leaping from the speakers, whether I was sitting close to them or about 6 feet away. I couldn't help but notice, like, man, these speakers just have some energy. And what I noticed even more was the resolution and the tone of the top end. It just had this naturalness there. Like the guitar had this natural bite to it. Parts of the drum kit just had this almost natural tang to it. I don't know. It's really hard to describe, but it sounded very, very natural for a speaker at its price point. And that leads me to the mid-range. So the mid-range is why people love the LS35A so much. There's just a naturalness to the tone, particularly when it comes to the human voice. They recreate it so authentically that few speakers tend to match it, even after all these decades. That's why there's still people who are big fans of this speaker to begin with. And when it comes to the sound artist, they do have that natural sounding mid-range, but it doesn't come in the form of that classic BBC mid-range bump. Instead, I would say that the mid-range is more linear and balanced than anything else, with again that mild dip in the upper mid-range. Yet somehow that doesn't really impact the authenticity and the tonal accuracy of the human voice. No, it's not quite up there with something like my Harbest, which I'll get to later on, but for the money, it is exceptional, just absolutely exceptional. It can make other products from like Klipsch and even ELAC and Triangle sound borderline broken by direct comparison. So for those of you who are very sensitive to natural tone, especially when it comes to the human voice, I mean, these speakers are going to be exceptional for you. And plus, there's this effortless resolution there and this tone there that also lends itself well to other instruments, particularly guitars and even piano to an extent. So it's just a very nice experience. And then you have the bass. The bass, for such a small speaker, is actually relatively strong. And because of the cone materials, it also has good tone to it. Now, is it the last word in speed? No. And let's face it, when you get right down to it, these are small speakers. They don't have explosive dynamic output. They're not going to sound that great at louder volumes. They're not going to sound that great in big rooms. But for what they are, they have a very entertaining sound, something that I think is worthy of the LS35A designation. even though some people may have a problem with it. I think these are very, very good speakers. And the last thing that I need to mention is how they perform in a desktop environment, because this is where I think they really shine. Because in a desktop environment, you need good driver integration, especially when your ears are only literally a foot or two away from the speakers. Most speakers just can't handle that very well, and these do. And even though they do have that bumped up bass, it doesn't sound boomy whenever they're placed next to a wall boundary. And again, for near field listening, this is great. Then you combine it with all the other strengths of the speaker, and it can make for a very fun time. And some of the weaknesses, the lack of the ability to sound great at loud volumes, that's kind of mitigated when your ears are so close. So for the desktop environment, I don't mind saying, hands down, under $1,000, my favorite solution that I've come across so far. Anyways, guys, that is going to be my general overview of the LS35A sound from Sound Artist. So now it's time to talk about what pairs up well to these speakers. Okay, so now it's time to talk about equipment matching. Now, I know that on paper, these speakers look like they are incredibly difficult to drive, but in reality, it doesn't take a whole lot of power to get them to sing. Still, there's going to be some guidelines to follow, so the first thing I want to mention is, even though they're easy to work with, there are two types of components that I would hesitate to recommend to pair up to these speakers. The first being most Class D amplifiers, and the second being any component that has a reputation for having a thin and dry sounding mid-range. The reason being is that when you pair those types of components up to these speakers, it starts to strip them of what makes them so special to begin with, which is that natural sounding mid-range. But beyond that, it doesn't really matter what you have, Class A, Class AB, tubes. Odds are it's going to sound pleasant through these speakers. However, there are going to be examples of very special matches, so let's go over that right now. So if you're in a desktop environment, I would highly encourage you to consider the following pairing: the Vista Audio Spark 2 with the Sound Artist. This combo is freakishly good in the desktop environment because you're dealing with components that are feeding off of each other's strengths. Both the Spark and the Sound Artist have what I consider to be class-leading mid-range for the money, so that combo just results in a ridiculous sounding mid-range. You have highs that are lively, yet at the same time non-fatiguing. You have strong bass. You just have really good integration and all the components necessary to make for an amazing desktop listening experience. Throw in an affordable DAC, and for around $1,000, you have killer sound for the money. Definitely and very highly recommended. But let's just say you're in more of a traditional two-channel environment. What should you do? Well, the interesting thing about the Sound Artist is that they are so aggressively priced that it's almost misleading in terms of what will pair up best to these speakers, because they're very resolving. And if anything, they will sound best when you pair them up to resolving equipment, which means usually pairing them up to components that are over about $1,000 in retail. An example of a great match with these is actually the Cambridge CXA81. And yes, I know that has a reputation for having a V-curve, and these have a slight V-curve as well, but there's some warmth to the sound of the Cambridge, and that combination just really livens up these speakers even more. It starts to fill out that slight thinness in the mid-range, and you're left with something that has great tone, great drive, and it allows for an overall very entertaining and pleasant listening experience. So that is very highly recommended. But if you have less than $1,000 to spend, I would say a good affordable tube amp, whether it's EL84 or especially EL34 based, would be a great match with these in more of your traditional setup. Because again, it doesn't take a whole lot of power to get these things to sing, and tubes and these speakers go together incredibly well. An example of affordable solid-state integrated amplifier would be, of course, the Iota VX SA3. I don't feel like it brings out the best of what these speakers have to offer, but it is a good match, and it'll get you at least a good way there. And now on the opposite end, if you do have some money to spend, a great match would be the Dynafrips, Hestia, and Hyperion combination at over $2,000. That, I think, represents the limit of what you should spend on components when it comes to pairing them up to something like the Sound Artist, which is really a compliment to them. They scale up very well. Otherwise, guys, that is about it. I don't really have any setup tips for you because these are compact speakers. The good news is they work very well against the wall boundary. In fact, this is one of those speakers you actually don't want to pull too far away from the wall. I would say 2 feet is probably the maximum for most people, or else you start to lose that low end output. So very easy speakers to accommodate. So now let's go over some of the caveats. Look, so I'll be straight up with you all. For $600, I have no legitimate complaints about this speaker. I mean, sure, the brand name doesn't exactly inspire confidence and ownership pride. In fact, it's completely new, and for some of you, that could be a deal killer. What may also be a deal killer is the fact that you have to buy these directly from China, meaning that if you try them and you want to return them, well, doing so could be fairly expensive. And I know some of you are going to ask, well, how come they don't have local representation in the US and in Europe and so on and so forth? Well, the answer is it costs money. Just as the reason why they won't sell on Amazon is because Amazon will want 22 to 23% margin plus other expenses. And guess what? You will be the one paying for that. And part of what makes these speakers so amazing is the value for the money, the price that you can get them for. Otherwise, guys, it's the same old story. It's a niche product. It's quality over quantity. It's small. It's not going to have the everyman performance of, say, an ELAC, a Klipsch, or a Triangle, where you have this bigger speaker with a bigger sense of scale, more bass, the ability to get loud. These speakers aren't really like that. So if that's what you're looking for, these are going to be an easy pass. But if you accept them for what they are, they represent an incredible value for the money, and that leads me to my final thoughts. So look, we're all human, which means we all have our own bias and prejudice. Now when it comes to audio, I try to keep as open of a mind as possible because I believe there's no replacement for first-hand experience. And when it comes to experience, I've gone through a number of Chinese-inspired LS35As, well beyond what you've seen featured at this channel. But still, I haven't heard them all, but I've heard enough to form my own prejudice towards those type of products. Because in my experience, most of the time, they look like an LS35A, but the build quality is never there, and even the sound is usually never quite there. You get a taste of it at a fairly good price, but it's never quite the same, which is why I've always felt like they had their place in the market. If you don't want to spend a lot of money but get the look and some of the sound, go with one of them. But if you want the real deal, you got to pay the money for it. This is the first speaker that has truly challenged that experience. In fact, I don't mind sharing a little bit about what I went through during the evaluation process because, truth be told, when I brought these speakers in for review, I was under the impression that they were $1,000 a pair. So when I listened to them on my desktop rig, I was immediately impressed. I mean, something was clearly special about these speakers in a way that I hadn't heard with other LS35As from China. In fact, I don't mind saying that I was telling some of my friends that, my God, these are really good. Like really, really good. Maybe the best $1,000 desktop speakers that I've heard so far. Really natural sounding. No, not quite as good as my Harbeth P3 ESRs in this application, but still, they're really good. This is impressive. And I remember thinking that, man, I'm going to have trouble with this review because now you're going to be put in this position to where you either spend $1,000 on these speakers or you spend just a little bit more on the used market for something like a P3 ESR or an older Rogers or whatever the case may be, right? So I was listening to them, and then I received the email from the importer saying, well, actually, they're $600 a pair shipped. And I was like, oh my God. Okay, that changes things. Now this has turned them hands down into the best desktop solution I've heard, like period. Just period, the end, done. I'm going to make that absolute statement right here and there. And then I decided, you know what, one thing I haven't done yet is I haven't put them on my regular 2-channel setup. And this is where I really don't like LS35As too much. This is where I think they tend to sound just a little bit boring. So I hooked it up, and I listened, and I was like, no way. No way, no way. These actually have life to the sound, right? I mean, they're actually projecting in a way that even my P3s don't, and in more of a realistic way. It's this weird thing that I'll talk about here in just a moment for the comparison. But I was like, no way, no way. They can't be this good. So I actually tried to sabotage the performance to match my prejudice, just to say, no, this can't be. Something's wrong here. But truth is, no, they're that good for the money. And I don't want to make it sound like they're better than, like, say, the Falcon, the Grahams, or the Harbest of this world, because I don't think that's true. But they're truly nipping at the heels of all of them. And I could even see in some circumstances how people would prefer these sound artists over some of the more official guys. It's kind of crazy. Anyways, that's going to be my long-winded conclusion for this review. Obviously, if you're interested in how they stack up to the Harbeth P3s, stick around. Otherwise, thanks. Excuse me. I always lose it at the end. Thanks for watching, and until next time, peace. Alright, so now it's time for a comparison that I think at least some of you may be interested in, and that's to talk about how the $600 Sound Artist LS35As compared to the, I forgot, it was either $2,300 or $2,500 Harbeth P3 ESRs in a rosewood veneer. Now, let's get this out of the way. When it comes to heritage and build quality, there is no comparison here whatsoever. I mean, first, with heritage, we're not even going to discuss that because the Sound Artist has no heritage to their brand name. But when it comes to build quality, I mean, look, just look at them. It's obvious. The P3s make the Sound Artist look cheap by direct comparison. And that's because what you're looking at with the P3 is a true luxury product. This is something that has heirloom build quality, something that you can pass down from generation to generation. When you buy a P3, you know it's going to last you for decades of problem-free service, and then when it does come time to replace the crossover, or at least the parts on the crossover, the parts are fairly generic, so you shouldn't have problems doing it, and once you get the service done, you should be good for another couple decades. The same can't necessarily be said for the Sound Artist because we just don't know. But now it's time to talk about performance, and I think the best place to begin is to discuss how they sound in the desktop application, because the LS35A was designed with near-field use in mind. I mean, literally, with the speakers only maybe a couple feet from the listener's ears. And in this environment, I think this is where the P3 ESR establishes itself as the overall superior speaker, because even though both of them have that LS35A type sound, the Harbest, to me, have a more natural presentation. When I listen to them in a desktop environment, I'm not focused on the sound of the speaker so much as I am on what I'm listening to. Whereas with the Sound Artist, they couldn't quite pull off the same trick, even though they are very good. So let's talk about the differences. In the near field, the Harbest have a fuller, more natural sounding mid-range. The top end is a little smoother, and the bass, although not quite as strong, is a bit more detailed. It's able to track more complex bass lines with just a little bit more clarity than what you'll get out of the Sound Artist. Now, by comparison, the Sound Artist, though, are a little bit more expressive. So the top end is a little bit more lively, so when you listen to music that has a little bit more of a jump factor to it, these speakers will capture that very well. And then there's going to be, in trade of this warmth, there's going to be just a little bit extra speed in the mid-range that the Harbest do not have. So both are going to be very good, but I think the P3s take it in the overall sense in the desktop environment. But what happens when you use them in more of a traditional two-channel application where you're sitting a good 5 or 6 feet away from the speakers? This is when things start to get a lot more even-keeled. So first, let's start off with the Harbest. When you listen to them in that application, you're getting that traditional Harbest sound. It's all about the mid-range, very natural sounding vocals. Yes, it's warm sounding. Yes, it has that classic BBC bump. It's not neutral, but it's still very pleasant, and it just sounds right. The top end is interesting because on one hand, it's rolled off, but on the other hand, there's some good detail there, partially due to the metal dome tweeter. However, even though I think the P3 ESR may have the best implementation of a metal dome tweeter of anything in its price class, most people can't even tell they're listening to a metal dome. To me, I can still hear some of that sound, some of the metallic sound to it. And the bass is good for a speaker of its size, but it's more about quality over quantity. And overall, it just makes for a relaxing listening experience. But I do admit that in that application, sometimes they can get just a little bit boring sounding. And that's where the sound artists come in. Because they have that more expressive sound, particularly in the top end and stronger bass, this is where I think they really shine and really show off what they can do. Because what you're getting is a speaker that not only is it actually comparatively slightly easier to drive, it seems to respond a little bit better to, say, tube amplifiers than to P3, but what you're getting is a sound that's a little bit more expressive from the listener's position. So if you like to listen to music that has some energy to it, or you're somebody who likes something that has just a little bit more life to the sound, then there's a good chance you may actually prefer the sound artist in that environment. The bass is notably stronger. And when you listen to, let's say, electronic or metal music, the Harbest sound good with it, but it's clear that you're listening to a small speaker that's starting to get out of its comfort zone in that traditional two-channel application and with that kind of music. Whereas the sound artist is actually well within his comfort zone. It's happy to play that music. It'll sound very engaging while doing so, provided you don't crank the volume up too high. So it really just depends on what you want. And that's why I say that the sound artist is truly nipping at the heels of the P3 ESR, because to have a speaker for $600 shipped that's an LS35A inspired design that can take the Harbeth P3s to task in at least a traditional two-channel application, I mean, I think that's special. I still, and I don't mind saying this, I would still put my own money towards the P3, just as I actually have. I mean, these are mine, I bought them, because I do value that heritage. I do value the build quality. And quite frankly, I still prefer the sound of the P3, even though the sound artist definitely represents the better value for the money in terms of raw performance. But that's just me, and a lot of people aren't going to feel that way. But anyways, guys, that's going to be my take on how these two speakers stack up. Look, I still think the LS35A is a great solution. A lot of people consider it to be old and outdated, but I've yet to hear anything else that has the same kind of natural tone to it. So until that day comes for at least the same amount of money, still going to like them. All right, guys, I've reached the end of the line here. Thanks for watching. Until next time, peace.